So let's take a look at one strong army list for every single faction in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it was high time to take a look at some strong competitive army lists in the wake of the last balance pass and see what some of the best players around are using to get their factions to the top of big tournaments in 10th edition. At time of recording, the big points update happened around about a month ago now. Lots of factions in the game had significant changes, some for internal balance, some for some fairly radical points overhauls, and I thought it would be good to just take a look at a cross-section of what's doing well, and look at one army for each faction that's placed high in an event. The ones included are slightly at random, it's just one example of what one good player has done well with, doesn't necessarily mean it's the absolute best, or the only good build for the army. A few of these certainly look a little bit off meta, but it does show that the armies are good enough to do well in a competitive environment. When you're playing in a big 5-round tournament, he basically guarantees to run into other players running the best stuff and knowing what they're doing. So if you can podium or win one of those, it does show that both the list and the player playing it are good. Currently in Warhammer 40k, outside of a few armies that have some issues, I'd argue that overall external faction balance really isn't in too bad a spot, at least relative to the vast majority of the game's history. At this point in time, certainly the skill of the player I'd say is probably more important than the exact army list for many armies out there. There are a whole ton of different factions that are winning events and placing well, even if certainly a few factions just tend to revolve around a few of the same units, definitely always more that they could do in terms of internal balance. For this run through I aimed to try and find tournament lists that went 4-1 or better at grand tournaments, ideally lists that went undefeated or event winners if easy, and I took a bit of a balance between a focus on actual event wins, the biggest events that people have performed well at, and recency, aiming for the last couple of weeks if possible. Not every army had good examples, of course, there are some factions that just played very little at the moment, but the vast majority of them did. In any case, let's jump right in, take a look at some top army lists and what units they've chosen to get them to the top. First up, we'll start with the Imperium, and starting off we have the Space Marines. The faction's not doing so great at the moment, still quite on a low win rate, though certain divergent chapters can do okay. This Gladius Ultramarines list by a Mark Hurtle managed to take second at the Maryland Open though, really quite a big tournament, and went undefeated doing so, 6 wins to no losses. Gladius Task Force is the one with the combat doctrines, the old in-depth Space Marines detachment, lots of mobility, and the scary fire discipline combo on offer, plus some nice enough battle tactics that reward captains. This Gladius is an Ultramarines one, and the only Ultramarines unit being used is Marnius Calgar himself with his Victrix Honour Guards, and it appears that interestingly for this one, Calgar is actually going to be running with a squad of company heroes, meaning that he's slightly lower investment than other people running him elsewhere. I've often seen him going with things like maxed out Blade Guard or Aggressors. That's still going to be a fighty and tough little unit though, looks like they're jumping out of a Land Raider Redeemer. The list is a triple Land Raider list, which is kind of unusual. 3 big armoured transports ready to disgorge some pretty scary melee threats into the midfield. In any case, between Calgar and the Victrix Guard, that company heroes unit should be able to manage the vast majority of lighter units in the game. It's quite tough and cheapish compared with what Calgar usually goes with. Then there's a big scary fire discipline type block, a captain in Gravis armour with a relic fist, and he takes the Honour Vehement for some extra fighting. He goes with the Apothecary Biologist with fire discipline for lethal hits, or running with a big unit of aggressors with the Boltstorm gauntlets. This one's the tried and tested fire discipline combo, where you can have a spectacular amount of shots with good AP, ignoring cover, and potentially threatening just to wipe out a massive enemy threat at range before whatever they can do charging into close combat with those power fists. As both the characters are attaching to the same unit, I guess they go in the Land Raider Crusader, which can also help with horde control if you happen to be playing some Unending Swarm or Green Tide or things. Otherwise, we've got a scary unit of 3 Centurion Devastators. They've got missiles and grav cannons. I'm not sure, but I guess that they'd be riding in the spare Land Raider Redeemer that doesn't seem to have a melee threat in it, unless the Assault Intercessors are going there. I guess that could deliver some very scary firepower into close range. Interesting to see the grav cannons on the Centurions. I've generally seen a lot more of the las cannons plus missiles on them. Gladius seems quite nice for them as well. Being able to access fallback and shoot means they could play a bit more aggressively than otherwise. The Land Raiders themselves are definitely massive threats. 2 Land Raider Redeemers with those Flamestorm cannons are genuinely good damage to midfield units in their own right, and they can all use Armour of Contempt and cover really well. And then finally, to round off the list, we've got a unit of Assault Intercessors with Power Fist and Hand Flamer. I guess there'd be just enough room for them in the Land Raider Crusader, unless they're just going to plan to sit around on the home field objective, which seems reasonable as I don't see what else would in this list. 1 unit of 3 Inceptors with the Assault Bolters, always handy to have for doing secondaries, and then a Storm Speeder Thunderstrike. That could give you +1 to wound against tanks and vehicles, and that does seem that it could be kind of massive for making these more anti-infantry things actually genuinely big threats against vehicles. The aggressive fire discipline thing would certainly like it well enough, and it could make the difference between the Flamestorm cannons of the Land Raider Redeemers being a sort of passing threat to vehicles, or actually being really quite scary. Overall, quite a fun Gladius list. Interesting to see triple Land Raider and some very armoured elites on the table, and this does look like it's got enough shots to handily deal with hordes and things. I guess not a lot of objective control, so they would have to absolutely smash out all of the damage as quick as possible. I thought I'd stop off and just showcase one other flavour of Space Marines as well. Here's one Ironstorm list by Ava Regalado, using it to take third at Loaded Dice Games May the 4th Open, going 5-1 against a field of 32 players. Ironstorm does seem to remain one of the strongest ways to play Space Marines, and certainly some of the Divergent chapters get some good mileage out of it. Games Workshop made some changes in the last balance pass, where they nerfed a couple of the enhancements a little bit, but I wouldn't say enough to make them bad, but also gave a buff to Vindicators, where they dropped in points a bit, and I'm not really too surprised to see them in attendance here. They're really excellent with the built-in Ironstorm core rule, which is re-rolling a single dice per attack. Focusing on the big damage dealer vehicle threats that make up the heart of the list, there's a long-range Gladiator Lancer to worry enemy tanks without having to worry about any sort of Oath of Moment style support, 2 fairly scary Gladiator Reapers for some massive anti-horde damage, and the Twin Link's devastating wounds keeps them relevant against vehicles as well. Sustained hits too can work really quite nicely with the Target Augury Web to allow you to get some lethal hits, and that combos really nicely with the Mercier's Weakness and Oath of Moment as well, potentially getting you a whole ton of sustained and lethal hits on 5s and 6s. Repulsor Executioners could also be a very scary target for that as well. There's 2 of them here armed with heavy laser destroyers, lots of scary guns, and some massive anti-tank threats. Another trick that the tanks and vehicles can do is when they're brought down to below half health, you can return fire. And that can be really disruptive on something like a Repulsor Executioner or similar, when you can be hitting out with an enormous amount of damage in the enemy's turn for just 1 CP. Finally, for the damage tanks, there's 2 Vindicators, again very scary for Mercier's Weakness, cheaper than they were before, and just very nasty frontline threats with some alright durability with their 2+ saves. Overall, certainly a Space Marine tank line that you can't ignore any one vehicle. They're supported by 2 Tech Marines who get them to +1 to hit and repair some wounds. One of them's got Master of Machine War, which is great support, allowing you to advance and shoot and fall back and shoot. Really nice as a get out of jail free card if the enemy tries to swarm all over your vehicles, and just good to gain lines of sight as well, and one with the Target Augury Web for the aura of lethal hits. Then while the scary gun tanks are destroying the enemy army, there's a bunch of objective scorers, some infiltrators to prevent deep strike, 1 unit of the 5 very cheap 80-point jump intercessors to skirmish with troops and maybe drop to do secondaries and things, 2 units of inceptors for some pinpoint plasma damage that the opponent can't really screen, and 2 units of scouts to hold down the midfield. 1 takes a missile launcher and 1 a heavy bolter. Overall looks like a pretty terrifying list. Firepower that's going to absolutely ruin anything that's out in the open really quite quickly, and enough objective support units that you're not particularly weak on that front either, should be scoring a fair amount of primaries and secondaries. We'll talk through the Divergent chapters at the end of the Imperium section, but let's move on to the Astra Militarum, and this list by Eero Saukonen used it play second at a tournament called MNN Kavat GT, going 4-1 against a field of 30 players. In the previous meta, the Guard basically had 1 strong armyless build revolving around Kazakin, Borgrin and Manticores for the most part, and that got kind of nuked from orbit. Points increases on literally everything. Even though the average Guard player wasn't exactly causing problems on the tournament scene, their win rate wasn't very high. It seems that with this list though, they've just decided to roll with the punches, basically take the same sort of things as they were before, but in lesser quantities, with the exception of no Kazakin being in this one. Not really too surprising there, to be honest. The points jump from 100 all the way up to 120 was particularly punitive. For characters to lead the list, we've got the God of Orders Lord Solar Leontus, for his free command point per turn, redeploying units and ordering things like Manticores, Tank Commanders and Borgrin. He'll likely be with that platoon command squad with the Master Vox and Grand Strategist. They'll be tied together with a Kaschan Jungle Fighter unit, I'd guess. Sat at the back, maybe on a home field objective, and able to broadcast the good orders out to Tank Commanders, Manticores and Borgrin as necessary. There's a mortar there which can allow Ursula Creed to hand out fields of fire against 1 unit, giving them extra AP against them, and helping to amp up that Manticore battery even further. Looks like she's just on her own in this list, and hoping there's no indirect fire about. Then for the actual big damage threats, there's 2 tank commanders with Demolisher multi-melters and las cannons. Pretty savage anti-tank units, these guys. And if you do kill them, then they get the chance to fire in death in the enemy's turn, which can be kind of big. A terrifying 3 manticores, which are now charged into the stratosphere a bit at almost 600 points, so you're making a massive commitment and taking these things now, but they certainly can rain absolute devastation down on the one unit that you need to destroy the most this turn, potentially taking out some very key objective holders, or some key enemy damage dealers, being particularly good at killing things with 3 wounds. They can be marked by a Scout Sentinel as well, allowing you reroll ones to hit, ignoring the indirect penalty, so you could have all of these hitting on a 2+. Then to skirmish for the midfield, we've got some super tough Borgrin. These went up from 80 to 90 points last time, but it seems like they're still being deemed as good enough to do well. 18 of them total, with brute shields and mauls, some heavy auxiliary frontline there. They can just make a lot of damage go away between good invulnerable saves, feel no pains, and -1 damage. I still think they're perfectly usable at 90 points, maybe still surprised to see like 18 of them though, as opposed to maybe in a bit more balance. Finally, there's 2 Kashan Jungle Fighter units that can scout forward and add a bit of objective control to the midfield points. The Borgren are very good at surviving there, but don't have as much OC, and they could be good for doing secondaries and things as well. Overall, definitely an interesting list and a very skewed one. Shows that the previously good guard stuff can still do very well at tournaments. I feel like this one is a list that you need to play very carefully though. There's just not that many slack units to do easier quality of life things like secondary objectives. Every single squadron unit would absolutely need to be used to the maximum efficiency, and you might have some tough decisions as to what exactly does what each turn. There's no cheap scions or Gaunt's Ghosts jumping around to do secondary objectives, for example. Next up, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. Again, another army that really suffered in the last update, particularly with their codex, dropping down from one of the stronger armies in Warhammer 40K to one of the weakest again. It still seems that their win rate isn't completely out of contention, around about the 44% sort of mark, and people both seem to be trying out the Shield Host and the Talons of the Emperor. They did look like the more interesting detachments as per just reading through the codex. This list by Harrison Darge plays seconded Auspex presents War Calls with 5 wins and 1 loss against a field of 47 players, so definitely shows that the Custodes can still place towards the top, even if the faction is overall struggling. This one's a Talons of the Emperor list, so it's got a bit more protection for the Custodes against things like mortal wounds from nearby Sisters of Silence, and I do think that quite a few of the stratagems are pretty useful, just maybe not quite as powerful as the Shield Host ones that came before. The list is headed up by Shield Captain in Terminator armor with a Castellan axe. He takes the Radiant Mantle for -1 to hit, and looks like he's going to be going with a fairly enormous Allarus Custodian Terminator squad with Guardian Spears. And then we've got Valerian with his -1 AP debuff and his slightly boosted melee profile. I guess he'd be going with the Custodian Wardens for their big feel no pain and -1 to wound things. Again, that'd be a unit that's harder to take out in melee than most. And then we've got Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus joining a squad of Custodian Guard with the Guardian Spears. She works great with them, both from shielding from being shot, but also their double shoot rules making her shooting kind of crazy, particularly if they can be on an objective while she unleashes it. Those blocks do have some pretty nice stratagems to support them, potentially +1 to wound for an injured enemy and reactive movements of 6 inches, a surprisingly punchy shooting one that could actually have Guardian Spears go off with a fair amount of damage. Interestingly enough, it looks like one of those units is riding its way to battle in a Venerable Land Raider. Not sure what the choice would be there, maybe the Wardens perhaps. Certainly one way to near guarantee that you can get to combat from a very long distance away and further dilutes enemy high AP anti-tank type shots. Hovering in the background, we've got some good anti-tank in the Gladius grav tanks, both very tough and very dangerous to heavy armour. And then finally we've got 3 units of Scouting Witch Seekers, 1 unit of 5 and 2 units of 4. They can give the mortal wound sort of defense things to the other squads nearby, potentially use a few of those dual stratagems to help them out if they wanted to, and just be handy units for screening and objectives and things. Overall, cool to see Custodes doing well despite their challenges at the moment. Definitely not an army that's easy to win with currently, so I guess a bit of testament to player skill there. Next up, for another struggling army in 40k, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, and these were one of the armies that I most struggled to find a strong performing army since the balance update. Even if they did get a fair few points cuts to some of their other damage dealers, it doesn't look like many people have been tempted to try them out that much. I think people are waiting for this promised summer update that's going to overhaul the army. I struggled to find a top placing list in singles events, so instead this one's a team event. This one was run by a Matthew Leverton, going 4 wins and 1 draw at May ITT Brum. Team events are a bit different, given that the overall focus is on the team winning rather than the list winning. so you can have some armies that counter other things quite well. I still think they're interesting enough for these going into the general field as well. Looks like the detachment chosen for this one was the Daemons Conclave, so basically Cash from Breaches the detachment. The Daemons one is the one that helps out the Cult Mechanicus type units, either getting ranged attacks to get extra AP within half range, or getting a genuinely good melee damage buff with +1 to the strength and attacks on the charge. They'll probably guess that the former of the two might have been used here, given that we don't really have any of the other units that would do well with the Cetacean and Savagery. I feel like if you were planning to use that regularly, you'd probably have some Fulgurite priests and things. In any case though, it doesn't look like this list made basically any use of any of the points cuts in the previous update. It's pretty much tried and tested some of the best cheap AdMech damage dealers and things, 3 massive units of Catastron Breachers with the arc rifles and the hydraulic claws, very scary squads that you just can't underestimate the shooting of, each of them headed up by a Tech Priest Manipulus for the lethal hits. 2 of them take lances and 1 the transonic cannon, 1 gets Mechanicus Locum for the debuffing battle shock, and another has the Tempercopia. That's the fight's first relic, so it means that if you put that breacher block in the midfield, it's going to be a problem, as if you charge it, they're going to hit you first with a whole bunch of hydraulic claws. Backing them all up are 3 units of 10 Skitarii Vanguard, not in transports or anything. They'll be around to give you some full rerolls to hit on the breachers. There's 2 units of Tarazzi Sterilizers, fast movers that can jump around doing secondary objectives and things. 2 units of Infiltrators to screen and tear up some enemy infantry and do objectives on the midfield. And then all the breaches are backed up by 8 Iron Strider engines, 3 Iron Striders with twin las cannons that are pretty tough, pretty mobile, and can genuinely contribute to a bit of anti-tank at long range, and then 2 individual Sidonian Dragoons with the Taser Lancers, cheaper skirmishers that can still do a little bit of damage to sort of light objective taking type units. Overall still does look like a scary list. Each of those breacher blocks is a threat that just can't really be ignored, both at range and in melee. They'll be the targets for basically all of the stratagems in the detachment as well, with things like 4+ invulnerable saves when you need them, and they can be quite scary in melee with +1 to wound on tap, and the ability to fight in death. In any case, I feel like it's still a bit of a waiting game for the AdMech right now, until Games Workshop does their rules update. Next up, we've got the Sisters of Battle. The Adepta Sororitas maybe got kind of side grains, maybe minor nerfs since the last balance update came out. They're still doing quite well on the tournament scene though, with win rates around about 52%ish. They got some small points changes, including a nerf to Arcoflagellants. For one example of a strong army list, this one by Jack Tite took second at the Saffron Walden GT, going 4 wins and 1 draw in a 40-odd player tournament. And it seems that despite the increase of Arcoflagellants for 10 models all the way up to 160 points, it still seems that he felt that 3 units of them were absolutely justifiable. Really quite a big investment in fighty chainflail freaks that can just stack a ridiculous amount of saves on any one enemy unit. I believe if they activate their extremist trigger word, then you can average like 40 hits at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1 and twin links. That's going to cause a bunch of chip damage even to tough stuff, never mind what it does to hordes. Otherwise, we've got the Triumph of St. Catherine as a nice centerpiece to help out with Miracle Dice and just be a big annoying nuisance. A Dialogus that can help with active faith farming things, changing the dice to a 6. A Missionary with a cheap Saintly Example, which allows you to get a boosted amount of Miracle Dice early in the game. And the Palatine with the Blade of St. Eleanor. Extra strength and damage for a melee weapon, and taking the Palatine from being a sort of tame melee threat to quite a serious one. Then we've got 2 units of 10 Battle Sisters, which I'd guess some of them might be being split in half with the Immolators. Good for farming up Miracle Dice, and the Multi-Melters and Melter Guns are pretty good targets for the Miracle Dice themselves. There's a big unit of 10 Dominions with Melter Guns. They get the assault weapons and re-rolling advance rolls, plus they can scout forward as well. Not sure if they'd be scouting inside that Rhino with a character attached, or whether the Rhino's being saved for the Arcoflagellants, they might just be foot slogging. Otherwise, 2 units of Seraphim for great objective scorers. The Move Shoot Move and the Hand Flamers are both great for getting to areas of the board that you wouldn't be able to and punishing enemy infantry when they were there. There's a single Penitent engine with the Flamers and Bob's Blades, now at the slightly cheaper cost of 55 points, and then 3 Castigators with battle cannons, just all-round efficient units with good firepower and ignore cover on the main gun. They've basically been strong for the Sisters all editions so far. Cool to see another take on Sisters. I feel like people are managing to build some really quite different lists with them at the moment. Games Workshop seems to have done okay for internal codex balance. Perhaps one of the most notable things about this list is no more than Varl and Paragon warsuits, which seem to be a staple in most of their armies. I guess it's not too long till the Sisters get a codex of their own. Hopefully that should add some other interesting options. Next up, we've got one for the Grey Knights, and this one's a rather unusual one by Justin Moore, using this one to take second at the Alamo GT, a big one with 100 plus players, and 6 wins and no losses. It's certainly one of the weirdest Grey Knights lists that I'd seen, as it doesn't really have many actual Grey Knights whatsoever. Instead, the list is basically Dread Knights plus Lamb Raiders, and a couple of Tech Marines in support, almost like a Grey Knight sort of version of Ironstorm. The list is made up of 5 Dread Knights and 3 Lamb Raiders. The Lamb Raiders are all Redeemers once more for the massive Flamestorm style threat in the midboard. Seems they've got no need to transport anything here to be worthy of inclusion in the list. Every one of them is going to be really hard to take out. Huge Overwatch threats in the midboard, and can use the True Silver Armor stratagem to worsen AP. Can be very nasty to try and take a Lamb Raider out with that and cover. Then beyond that, there's 5 Dread Knights. 2 of them are Grandmasters, and they all have the same loadout. 1 Incinerator each, 1 Psy Cannon each, and a Great Hammer. The Incinerator means that they're also a very nasty torrent threat against hordes. The Psy Cannons are far better against armoured targets now at strength 10 and ignore cover and damage 3. And the Great Hammers are particularly nice against enemy heavies in close combat, particularly the ones on the Grandmasters where they can activate their massive rerolls. One of the Grandmasters takes the Sigil of Exigence, teleporting away when shooting, and one takes Inescapable Wrath. That's the +1 to charge rolls one. I guess that could be handy enough out of Deep Strike, or maybe Teleport Assault to jump them round the table. Otherwise, the regular Dread Knights are the ones that can advance and charge, so they can be moving a very fast amount of distance across the board, and still get maximal shooting, and still charge after, so catch up with the enemy and things hiding quite quickly. And then to support the lot of them, there's 2 Brotherhood Tech Marines, who can make the Dread Knights and the Lamb Raiders hit a bit harder, plus give you some extra wounds and be handy enough little units to do objective type things. And finally, 1 tiny unit of 4 Inquisitorial Henchmen. Maybe it could be a super cheap thing to hold down a primary point or do a secondary. Certainly very weird as Grey Knights lists go, and maybe going a bit counter to the balance update given that Dread Knights went up and things like the Strike Marines went down. Again, kind of like the Ironstorm list, it feels like a list that you'd have to play really quite carefully. It's certainly got enormous amounts of damage that'll probably win the damage game overall against enemy lists with loads of defense, but not a whole load of objective control or options for scoring, so unless all those torrents can clear out all the infantry on the board super quickly, then you might have some issues. Next up for the Imperium, we've got the Imperial Knights. They were unchanged in the balance pass and kind of similar to where they were before. Not a bad win rate overall, though tending to do far better in more casual play versus competitive. That often tends to be the nature of Knights as a bit of a stat check type army. This list that did well was run by Bjorn Eriksson, New Venues to Conquer, winning 4 games, drawing 1 in a medium-sized tournament of 32 players. This one's basically Canis Rex, a Calidus Assassin, and 10 Armigers, so going very heavy on the little guys. There's no real surprise with Canis Rex being the centrepiece. He's the most commonly taken Questoris pattern. Just surprising amounts of damage with hitting on 2+ and getting sustained hits on 5s. And a couple of free rerolls and boosted stats in places don't hurt either. So Hector getting out after is quite fun too, and occasionally can be good for victory points. Otherwise, 4 Helverins to hold down the backfield and contribute a whole bunch of anti-fly shooting with their autocannons. They can be kind of good counter-meta things against stuff like Necron Catan. And then 6 trusty Armiger Warglaves, 150 points for nice all-round threats. They do very well out of the single rerolls from Lay Low the Tyrants, and they take melter guns in addition to their thermal spears rather than heavy stubbers. Finally, the Calidus Assassin is a bit more expensive at 100 points now, but can just go jumping around the board doing secondaries. Still probably more useful in a Knights list versus anywhere else, just due to them not having the expendable units to use that way. Lastly for the Imperium, let's take a look at one list for each of the Divergent chapters. First up, we've got the Blood Angels, with this list by Max Schwarzer, first at the Great Game. 5 wins to no losses at a 30-odd player tournament. Still seems like Sons of Sanguinius Blood Angels are going strong, and their win rate isn't too bad overall, kind of balanced at around about 50%. Kind of nice to see that they haven't fallen off too much. I was a little bit apprehensive that they might a bit, given that basically most of their top tier units got nerfed, the Marty's Death Company and the Sanguinary Priests, though there still seem to be plenty of the same picks in this army. It seems the points got on Sanguinary Guard wasn't enough to be tempting either. Otherwise, this one still goes very Death Company heavy. There's Lamarties with his -1 damage and his damage buff running with a big unit of Jump Pack Death Company. With Inferno Pistols and Power Fists, they basically make a mess of whatever they can get in contact with. Sons of Sanguinius making those Power Fists strength 10 and giving you an extra attack on the charge, they will just utterly delete something. There's then a regular Chaplain with a regular unit of Death Company Marines, likely jumping out of that Rhino. The same sort of damage output, but on foot, so a little bit cheaper. And the Chaplain gives them the +1 to wound. There's then 2 captains with Power Fist, leading 2 units of Assault Intercessors with a Power Fist in each one. They're in Impulsors to transport them up the board. And if you activate the captains once per game fighting bonus and use a free stratagem on their Lance type stratagem, then those tiny units can hit very, very hard, particularly with reroll wound rolls against things on objectives. Finally, for the HQs, there's the Sanguinor, a common pick in competitive lists. He can basically heroic intervene from off the board with fights first, so basically try and turn a bad combat into a very good one, perhaps cutting down a bunch of enemy units before they even get to strike. Otherwise, beyond that, we've got 5 Jump Intercessors, just generally efficient at 80 points, and more so in Sons of Sanguinius, great for objectives and skirmishing. Interestingly, there's a massive great big chunk of Eradicators, one big unit of 6 of them with 2 Multi-Melters. Not sure if they might be a Strategic Reserves or Rapid Ingress type threats depending on the opponent. Some standard objective holders in a unit of Infiltrators and a unit of Scouts, and then perhaps the most interesting thing is the Death Company Dreadnought armed with Blood Talons and dual Heavy Flamers. They got a bit cheaper in the last points update, and their durability is still kind of so-so, but if they do get into combat, then they can be massively disruptive, basically getting to shoot or fight again each time they're targeted, which can make them very hard to take down if they do get into your ranks, or could be blazing away with just multiple heavy flamer attacks and things in the enemy turn, even if they're not in combat. It could also be an interesting choice for putting in strategic reserves as well. If you take the Magna Grapple, then you get +2 to charge against monsters and vehicles, so against some army lists might be getting some very easy charges from off the board. Overall pretty scary stuff. If it can get screened and gunned down, then it's not going to be the biggest problem ever, but if it does get into the ranks, it could be surprisingly disruptive. In any case, glad to see the Blood Angel still doing well, and with the Sons of Sanguinius detachment too. Next up, we have another Ironstorm list for the Dark Angels, this one by a Ryan Burns, who used it to take first at Heroes of the Mid-Table Spring GT, going 5 wins to no losses at a 40-player tournament. Unfortunately, it still really seems that Dark Angels are mainly defaulting to Ironstorm, rather than going to their cool-themed units or their detachments. Doesn't seem that there's been many people using Deathwing Knights or Lionel Johnson despite the points changes, though that definitely doesn't diminish the achievement of taking home a grand tournament for the Unforgiven. It seems that despite the Ironstorm enhancements and the Stormraven gunship both going up in cost, they both managed to still see a place here. For Dark Angel's unique stuff, as per quite a lot, it seems to be Azrael plus a Ravenwing Darkshroud, supporting the Ironstorm with extra command points to feed into their great stratagems, and then having a Stormraven deliver a Dreadnought, which seems like quite a nice punchy strategy, and have the Landspeeder Darkshroud protected with the stealth and the benefit of cover. Add Armour of Contempt into the mix and they can be very hard to kill indeed. Otherwise, for the big scary firepower units in the list, there's a second Redemptor Dreadnought and 2 long-range Gladiator Lancers that can be efficient anti-tank damage without much support, saving the big stratagems like Mercier's weakness maybe for the Stormraven. There's also a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to give you the +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles if you need it, and then a couple of Tech Marines and a Lieutenant with a combi weapon bearing the good enhancements, the Target Augury Web for the lethal hits, Adept of the Omnissiah for cancelling failed saves, and Master of Machine War with the Lieutenant for the advance and shoot or fall back and shoot. There's a unit of Infiltrators that I guess would normally be used for taking the home field objective and denying deep strike there. And then perhaps the most interesting bit is for Azrael. It seems with the points drop on Hellblasters, they're good enough to get an include here at 115 points per 5. With Azrael's sustained hits, they're certainly a very scary shooting unit, and could potentially be okay for Overwatch and firing on death when the enemy kills them, of course. I'm not 100% sure if they go in the Stormraven to deliver themselves for a very scary damage punch alongside the Redemptor and the Flyer itself, or they're starting on the board and playing a bit more conservatively. In any case, though, it seems that the Dark Angel Stormraven combo is still alive and well, despite Games Workshop slapping it with a points increase. Next up, we've got the Wolves of Fenris, who seem to have somehow become one of the biggest winners out of the last points update, despite not really getting too many adjustments or anything, seeming to bound straight from mid-tier to one of the top-performing armies in the game. They've won a fair few grand tournaments, and a few people seem to have been experimenting with the Champions of Ross, though mostly it is the Stormlance still. The mounted detachment that's more aimed at White Scars that really buffs Thunderwolves, giving them advance and charge and some powerful access to some nice stratagems like -1 to hit and wound at range, and some cool reactive movement shenanigans. This list does shake up the formula a little bit. It still has the standard core of 3 units of 6 Thunderwolves with shields, and each of those gets a Wolfguard Battle Leader that can also profit from the +1 damage that they get on the charge. One of those takes Hunted Instincts and 1 Portents of Wisdom. Otherwise, to join them, there's a Wolf Lord with Fury of the Storm. He can add +1 to charge for the unit, and the Wolfguard battle leaders have their own reactive move style things. And Logan Grimnar's here as well, making one of those Thunderwolf units just an enormous threat on Storm Rider, and he has that full turn of big rerolls to charge and to hit in the fight phase. Harold Deathwolf heads up the third squad. Then beyond that, we've got Bjorn the Fell-Handed with a multi-melter. He can debuff an enemy stratagem and is just a generally scary, big fighty and very tough dreadnought. There's a lone lieutenant with a combi weapon to help with objective scoring things, and Ragnar Blackmane makes an appearance as well. Looks like he's riding around in an impulsor with a shield dome, accompanied by a unit of assault intercessors, giving him some big rerolls to wound against things on objectives, and he does have some nice general purpose mid-strength attacks to make that really good. Finally, there's a Whirlwind for an interesting little bit of indirect fire to maybe hit a few things that the Wolves can't reach, and then 2 units of Scouts to help out with cheap objective and scoring type duties. These ones take a missile launcher and a sniper rifle. It seems that a lot of armies are finding these style Space Wolf lists a real struggle to deal with now. The Thunderwolves are just a pretty amazing profile, with good toughness for the cost with their invulnerable saves, move very fast and hit very hard with the attached characters, and make great use of all of those detachment stratagems. And then the different Space Wolf lists tend to give support in quite different ways. Certainly interesting to see Logan on the table as well as Bjorn. And the Ragnar and Assault Intercessors unit seems to be very threatening on paper, could certainly make a mess of enemy objective scorers that might have thought they were safe from Thunderwolf death. Next up, we've got the Black Templars, who seem to have been unseated by the Space Wolves as the top performing Space Marine chapter for win rate at least, though they're still, I'd say, in the upper half of armies in the game. One list that did well recently was this one by Ben Sherwine, using it to take first at Icebreaker Warhammer 40K GT with 5 wins to no losses. Black Templars do pretty well with a whole load of detachments, their own Righteous Crusaders and Ironstorm in particular, but this one's using Firestorm Assault Force, the one that gives you +1 strength and advance and shoot for a bunch of your units. Pretty good for the Black Templar Impulsors, and quite nice for the Firstborn Crusader squads as well. The list is headed up by the powerhouse in melee that is Helbrecht, who is amazing with the Sword Brethren, getting their +1 damage rule to work on him, an Emperor's Champion, and a Genestealer with Champion of Humanity. That's the one that allows you to ignore modifiers, and finally a Lieutenant. It looks like all of these are running with the Primaris Sword Brethren, 3 units of 5 of them with a Thunderhammer, Lightning Claws, and some fancy pistols. 2 of them inside Black Templar Impulsors with the Multi-Melter bolted on, which the Firestorm will quite like, and one of the units in a Land Raider Redeemer. I might guess this would be Helbrecht and the Lieutenant joining one within the Land Raider Redeemer, and then perhaps an Emperor's Champion led and a Genestealer led one that are in the Impulsors perhaps. They can hit very hard in Firestorm as well, they get a bit of better shooting at close range, and then can access the +1 to wound stratagem in close combat if they need, so you can be hitting it even harder than you might normally with those scary Sword Brethren. Otherwise, for some more savage shooting, there's 4 units of 5 Firstborn Crusaders, all with Melter Gun and Multi-Melter and Inferno Pistol. They're riding to war into Rhinos, meaning that you could potentially be scooting the Rhinos really quite a long way up the board and opening fire with 4 multi-melter shots out of the top if you wanted, or moving normally and getting them within 12-inch range and hitting the enemy with a whole bunch of strength 10 melter shooting. With all the transports and Rhinos and Land Raiders and things, you've got loads of options for using all the very nice stratagems as well. Things to allow re-embark or jumping out of Rhinos and shooting in retaliation from the enemy shooting them. Overall, a very scary amount of stuff going forward to cause massive damage, and then for objective support there's 1 unit of Intercessors for sticky objectives and 1 unit of Scouts for some mid-board presence, both fairly standard things with Space Marines. Overall, a pretty cool list. Nice to see Firestorm doing well, and Black Templars do have quite a lot of scary synergy with them, lots of good choices for transport type units. I'm sure they'll enjoy the +1 to wound and close combat style stratagem with this one. Finally, for the Imperium, we have the Deathwatch. As often seems to be the case for the Xenos Hunters, I did struggle to find a high placing list for them. Basically no one's really playing them competitively whatsoever. And having a look at Best Coast pairings, I could see a few people taking them to grand tournaments, though seeming to wind up mid-table at best. I think in reality they maybe aren't quite as far behind things, as they can just play as basically standard Space Marines, and do fine with things like Gladius or Ironstorm. It's just very few people actually choosing to run things specifically as Deathwatch in favour of other choices. In any case though, for one example of someone flying the flag for Deathwatch, there's a list by Doug Lewis here, who used it to take 41st at that big Alamo GT. 3 wins and 3 losses, and nice to see some Black Spear Task Force representation, actually using the Deathwatch themed attachment, and holding their own against a very strong field. They'd be guaranteed to run into some strong lists at an 100 player event. This list is headed up by a chaplain with Thief of Secrets and a lieutenant with a combi weapon for some objective shenanigans. The Thief of Secrets is the one that allows you some boosted melee damage. For the actual Deathwatch unique stuff, the main event is the Proteus kill team as it often tends to be. 3 Storm Shields, 4 Thunderhammers, 3 Long Vigil melee weapons and 3 Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators. Certainly looks like this one runs with a chaplain for a pretty terrifying melee beatdown style unit. It looks like they're charging out of a Land Raider Redeemer. The Proteus team get +1 to their hit rolls normally against anything that isn't below half strength. Otherwise, we've got a Spectre's kill team for a bunch of infiltrators, 5 Assault Intercessors, including a Power Fist for some objective presence, 5 regular Intercessors, including a Thunderhammer, 1 big unit of Assault Centurions, which is kind of fun, a big unit of 6 of them with melter guns, and they take the Centurion bolters as well. I kind of wonder if they might be doing a bit of deep strike shenanigans, using the Deathwatch Teleportarium style stratagem. It could be quite nice to have them jump out of deep strike, and they could potentially even use the Deathwatch bolter type stratagems on the Centurion bolters as well. Perhaps getting some fairly scary things like anti-infantry 2+ or extra AP from Kraken rounds. Otherwise, there's 2 units of Inceptors with assault bolters for close range deep strike, 1 unit of 3 Eradicators, which again could be an interesting one to teleport if the enemy's got some vehicles worth wrecking, 1 unit of 5 Infiltrators for the deep strike denial, and a Repulsor Executioner to provide some long range fire support that could also transport some things like the Eradicators if necessary. Overall though, given no major strong placings that I could find, Deathwatch certainly feel like they're in need of help. The fact that they were completely untouched despite being basically unplayed and struggling last time did fuel some rumours that they might be being folded into some sorts of Agents of the Imperium style offering. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos next. At time of recording, we still haven't had tournaments happening that have been making major use of the new codex yet, so this one's a little bit of a last hurrah for Index Chaos Space Marine army lists. I'm certainly looking forward to taking a look at some Chaos Space Marine tournament lists once we've had a week or two of people posting results. In any case, Chaos Space Marine seem to have been doing okay at placing well in tournaments. This index list was by a Grisha Gerwert, who used it to take first at Extra Snicks 3.0, going 5-0 against a 32-player mid-sized tournament. This one's using the Index Slaves to Darkness detachment, which has now been reinterpreted as Pact-bound Zealots for the Codex. It broadly feels kind of similar, though the Dark Pacts aren't quite as impactful as they were. Not getting the boosted effect if you fail them, but it's still quite nice for anything with a Chaos icon, as admittedly quite a lot of the units here have. This one's a fairly even mix between some powerful melee and powerful shooting. We've got 3 Rhinos moving up the board, 1 Undivided and 2 Slanesh. The Undivided one is the big threat one with 2 units of Chosen in it, each of them accompanied by a Chaos Lord and a unit that's just absolutely capable of utterly demolishing something in close combat using the stratagem for full rerolls to wound, which you can get free with the Chaos Lords, plus their big once per game damage boost. They can advance and charge out of those Rhinos as well, so you can get those squads a very scary way across the board. Otherwise, we've got 4 units of 5 Legionaries, just monstrously efficient at just 80 points for a unit that can effectively have 2 Power Fists, a Balefire Tome, and a heavy weapon. 2 of the units have las cannons and 2 have Reaper chain cannons. One of them looks like they run with a Master of Executions as well, for potentially some big hitting rerolls if you can chip a wound off the target. Overall, just great and efficient unit. They can advance and charge with a Slanesh stratagem and get exploding hits on a 5+ with sustained hits in melee. Otherwise, we've got 5 Slaneshi Warp Talons, can pretty easily butcher enemy light infantry as well as being able to get there. 3 Bikers, which are just very efficient with 2 Melter Guns and a Power Fist, looking super great in the new Codex points for 70 points. 10 Cultists with sticky objectives and a last hurrah for their firearms and special weapon loadout that Games Workshop took away. 2 sets of 3 Nurglings for controlling the midfield as allies, and then some scary firepower, mainly with Nurgle. 2 Predator Destructors with sponsored las cannons, 2 Vindicators that are Nurgle aligned, and one of the Predator Destructors is Undivided, maybe threatening those rerolls if it needs it. The Vindicators are just horribly terrifying with those exploding hits on 5+, and the ability to shield them from return attacks with the Nurgle strat. Most of the units here didn't really get particularly worse going from Index to Codex, and they do have a fair few other detachments to play with. I guess that there'll be a fair few lists placing well with things like Renegade Raiders, and the Vashtor Demon Engine one looks good for some fairly obscene damage as well. Should be fun to see what comes next for the Chaos Marines. Next up we have the Thousand Suns. It seems that Tzeentch's Legion are indeed doing pretty well after the points update, only taking quite a small points nerf to a couple of enhancements and having a bunch of peripheral datasheets upgraded a bit. They certainly look like they're shaping up to be one of 40k's strongest factions at the moment. This list by Taroxe Alroyo, which I'm almost certainly pronouncing wrong, placed him first at an enormous grand tournament in Andorra, going 7 wins and 1 draw at a massive 200 plus player GT. As with the vast majority of Thousand Sons army lists, it starts with Magnus plus Ahriman, and broadly the rest of it is a whole bunch of Rubik Marines backed up by various sorcerers. Seems that despite the points cut, Scarab Cult Terminators weren't considered quite interesting enough for this one. For the sorcerers backing up the army, there's 1 Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex for the extra damage dealing, 3 Exalted Sorcerers on disc, 1 with the Umbrellific Crystal for teleporting about the board. I'd guess that some of those might be running solo, and they can mess with enemy movement as their power, and then 1 regular Thousand Sons Sorcerer with Lord of Forbidden Law. His power is making his squad not be able to be shot outside of 18 inches, and he can threaten to double up on a second Kabbalistic ritual, say if he needed 2 Doom Bolts or to move 2 units about if it made sense to. They're all backing up 5 units of 5 Rubik Marines with Soul Reaper Cannon, Warp Flamers and Warp Flame Pistol, quite nice against any hordes that happen to be about, but otherwise just sturdy troops with good objective control. Looks like 10 of them are riding in a Rhino. There's 10 cultists with special weapons which went down in cost very slightly at the last update. They're kind of fun with their scout move thing, and they get an invulnerable save, and a Mutalith Vortex Beast that can extend the range on Kabbalistic rituals, so you could be throwing out things like potentially double Doom Bolts all the way out to a big 36 inches, which is kind of mad. As with a lot of Thousand Sons lists, I feel like Magnus is likely to be the focus of the stratagems and the Kabbalistic rituals quite a bit. He can move ridiculously fast and hit incredibly hard with his psychic shooting backed up by melee, buffed by his own rules, and a nice reroll stratagem, potentially Kabbalistic rituals too. It does seem that Thousand Sons are set to remain in their top spot as one of the game's best armies at a competitive level. Next up, for the Marines of Khorne, we've got the World Eaters. This one's a list by Brian Doherty, who used it to place first at a 44-player tournament called CTC Warhammer 40K Championship Open. The World Eaters got a few nice points changes to Jackals and Khorne Berserkers last time round, and it seems to have definitely helped them out a fair bit. They're sort of mid-table at the moment at around about a 50% win rate and some performance at top events. As World Eaters go, everything's going to be about the big melee rush, but this one feels like quite a balanced list within that. Always worth starting with Angron, with massive movement, massive damage, and the game-changing chance to come back later after he has been slain. Hard not to include him. And then we've got 2 Rhinos full of Berserkers, 1 unit of 10 and 1 unit of 5, and one has a World Eater's Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive. Still an enormous threat, even if it has been nerfed quite a bit, both in points and in rules. They're very scary to have jumping out on the mid-board objectives, potentially really quite problematic to try and take down if the opponent wants to move up and take those objectives, potentially threatening to blood surge into close combat. Then we've got 2 units of the Cultist Jackals with their Skull Smasher and Mauler Chainblade. They get the powerful sticky objectives type rule and can also help you to get better blessings rolls with the Blessing of Khorne icon. Then there's 2 units of 8 bound, 1 unit of 3 with their Lacerators, and then 1 big unit of 6, which Lord Invocators could be quite helpful for scouting up the board. A nice and absolutely terrifying melee threat that could be smashing into the enemy lines turn 1, particularly if you are able to combine the +2 movement with the advance and charge. Then there's 2 Chaos Spawn, which will be quite nice as objective skirmishers, and 1 Mauler Fiend, really quite an efficient demon engine and a threat to most things on the charge. That one takes the Lasher Tendrils for the extra attacks against hordes. It's already hitting hard enough against heavies, I guess. I feel like World Eater's melee lists are definitely quite skill dependent. Lots of really valuable stuff that's going to have a massive impact if it can make it into combat, but has the potential to get shot down early if you play too carelessly with them. I must admit I do think this one's quite a fun one to see winning a grand tournament though. I feel like if you were just to make a fun and fluffy style list that just used a whole bunch of archetypical World Eaters units, then this would be more or less it. Next up, we've got the Sons of Mortarion in the Death Guard. This list was run by Matthew Sneed, who used it to place second at the Icebreaker Warhammer 40K GT, a fairly big 77-player one, and it looks like he went undefeated. Again, this one feels like a fairly good balance of Death Guard units, some troops, some Terminators, some heavy support, plus taking some allied Nurglings and a few allied Knights gun turrets. First up, there's Typhus, who looks like he's heading up a big unit of 6 Death Shroud Terminators. That's a block that should demolish most things in its way. And really not all that expensive either at 320 points. It could potentially be an enormous rapid ingress threat, but either way it's going to have the damage and defense just to utterly dominate one central objective. Typhus is pretty much auto-include with that mortal wound attack in his base profile at 80 points. Then there's a bunch of Plague Marines and Rhinos with support characters, 2 Rhinos total, 1 with 10 Plague Marines in it and 1 with 2 sets of 5. Looks like the 2 sets of 5 are more heavily equipped for melee with the heavy plague weapons in them that one big squad of 10 instead takes some bubotic weapons, plague spewers, melter guns, and a blight launcher, I'd guess that one would probably be running with either the blight spawn or the putrefier maybe. Both of their buffs seem alright on quite a big unit. Then there's a couple of malignant plague casters, not too bad close range damage with their plague wind attack, but they can potentially be really quite disruptive with their pestilent fallout, psychic power, disrupting the enemy movement and charges, plus the gift of contagion could be kind of fun to debuff shooting if they were close enough. Kind of cool to see them being used in the push going forward. I've not seen as many people use them versus some of the other characters like just say more biologist putrefiers. Otherwise for the list, those 3 units of Nurglings are always very efficient for secondary objectives, screening out the enemy with infiltrate, maybe being super cheap to deep strike and do secondaries later, and debuffing the enemy if they get too close. And finally there's a bunch of heavy firepower, 3 Predator Destructors with heavy bolter sponsons, interesting to see them rather than the Las there. I guess you could get extra AP from the Contagion debuff, and combined with the Predator's core rule you could be AP3 against infantry, which is kind of fun. I've seen more people using the las cannons though. Otherwise there's a featured bloat drone with a flesh mower for a nice fast outrider with some melee threat, and then 2 easy to use War Dog Brigands as fast moving Chaos Knight gun turrets with both anti-infantry and anti-vehicle type shooting. They take havoc launchers and could help out a little bit on objectives as well with their OC. Overall certainly looks like quite a dangerous Death Guard list, lots of heavy fire support, and all the Plague Marines and Terminators look like things that you really can't afford to ignore in the mid-board, given a turn or 2 to deal maximal damage, and they'll break a lot of stuff. Talking of Chaos Knights, let's take a look at a few more. This one's a list by a Ratnu Vaidya, who used it to place 3rd at a tournament called Turbulent Tides, a GT in Whitby. Chaos Knights do seem to be one of the armies that just hasn't really seen all that much play since the balance update. They didn't get any nerfs, but they didn't get any boosts to their big scary knights, which I think would have been quite nice. And as such, it's mainly still War Dog spam. Occasionally people like to play a Chaos Knight Lancer, and then a few allied Nurglings. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this one it goes along a similar theme. A single War Dog Stalker, as it's a character and can be your warlord. That one's going for tank busting with the Slaughter Claw and the Demon Breath Spear. 5 War Dog Brigands with the same sort of scary gun turret with the extra AP. And then 5 of the monstrously efficient War Dog Carnivores, absolutely massive melee threats that move fast, hit very hard, and can be quite nice with tank shock. They can be pretty nice for being able to use that stratagem to move through walls as well to help them get a grip on their prey. All of them have havoc launchers as well, so potentially when all of that's focused you can have an alright amount of indirect fire, maybe enough to clear a light infantry squad or so. Then they take a healthy amount of allies, 5 units of 3 Nurglings, absolutely excellent just for objective and board control, particularly when your cheapest other units are 140 points or more, and then 1 Lonely Beast of Nurgle, a slightly tougher nuisance unit that can take some objectives if they're uncontested. In any case, it's a solid performance to take Chaos Knights to a podium place at a tournament. There haven't been too many people doing so since the latest points update. Hopefully Games Workshop might give the big knights a bit of love in the future. Finally, for the realm of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demons. This army list is by a Kyle Treyer. He used it to take first at really quite a big tournament called Mayhem in 3D. Really quite a big event of 140 players, and the Chaos Demon list went undefeated. Chaos Demons do seem to have been breaking through a bit more since the points updates. They didn't get any changes themselves, but I feel like they weren't really in the worst place before, and quite a spooky army that lots of enemies don't really know exactly how to play against right. They do have a whole ton of options between their jumping things on and off the board. I must admit I think it's really quite cool that the list starts with one of each of the greater demons, a Lord of Change with his staff that's upgraded to the Everstave for a bit more shooting power, Scarbrand himself, the Bloodthirster with the Ruined Wings. He's got massive melee damage and a fairly frightening ability to have a chance to stop enemies falling back, which could be kind of massive. A great unclean one with the Bile Sword and Flail with Endless Gift. He seems to be fairly auto-include for demons at the moment, really cheap and just ridiculously tanky. It's usually not worth anyone's time trying to kill him, so he can go about dealing damage on midfield objectives for a fair bit of the game. And finally a Keeper of Secrets with a Shining Aegis and Sword. Beyond that we've got a spooky lone operative in the Mask of Slanesh, 10 Demonettes for some fast moving OC. Potentially they could get boosted damage against the Mask's target. 3 units of 3 Nurglings, doing what they do here just as they will do for the majority of other Chaos armies out there. 10 Plague Bearers for some tanky objective holders. 3 units of 3 Flamers of Tzeentch, which are just a quite nice skirmish problem solver type unit. Nice to jump around the battlefield with their ability to do some damage out of deep strike with their ranged attacks, plus they can threaten some OK overwatch in a pinch. And 3 units of 5 Fleshhounds, again quite nice for sort of objective skirmishing and dealing with enemy lighter infantry units. Just quite a nice combination of fast, tough, and some OK damage. Overall looks pretty fun and quite nice to see a bit of dedication to all the Chaos deities, really quite an undivided Chaos pantheon there, and lots of big hitters with some good objective support to back them up. Finally moving on to Xenos, and we'll start out with the Tyranids. For most people the Tyranids still seem to be on the lower end of the Warhammer 40k power spectrum. Tournament win rates around about 45% or so, but they're definitely not out of the running at big events. This invasion fleet won by someone going by Jaquito managed to take first at a 42-player tournament, going 4 wins and 1 draw. And there was that big and fun-looking unending swarm list that won Games Workshop's Dallas event, carpeting the board with a whole bunch of Termagant with spine fists. This invasion fleet list does look pretty fun though, invasion fleet being quite nice to counter enemy vehicle armies if you happen to run up against them with the option to get lethal hits on everything, and otherwise giving you that 5+ feel no pain stratagem that the Winged Hive Tyrants can hand out a second copy of if you need it. Just quite nice to have that kind of durability boost on the unit that's most relevant each turn. The primary damage dealers of the list are the standard good ones for Tyranids, 3 Exocrines and 2 Maleceptors, all of them just nice big hitting damage 3 firepower, and they're both alright defense for their cost, each in their own way. And then there's a whole bunch of fun stuff supporting them. We've got Old One Eye for a massive great big melee threat, who seems to be running solo here. No Carnifex bodyguards for him. Death Leaper for some nasty lone operative action on the mid-board objectives. He can up the chance of enemies failing battle shock a bit, and is just generally efficient. And you're a tyrant that often seems to loiter in the backfield in Tyranid lists, giving you that big turn of boosted shadow in the warp, but just being quite nice for a whole bunch of torrent attacks as well on a cheapish monster. And that Winged Hive Tyrant, which is kind of fragile for its cost, but might be a good idea to have it just hiding behind a ruin for a fair bit, handing out extra feel no pain for a turn or two, and then when it makes sense to and the balance is tipped, contributing to the game by moving forward very quickly, hitting something with that bone sword, and making its presence felt. It takes adapted biology for a little bit of extra protection as well, and also has an ability to debuff enemies' attacks. Finally for the HQ section we've got a Broodlord with Synaptic Linchpin. That's a boosted synapse range that could be helpful for some of the other swarms in the midboard, and he's running with a big squad of 10 Genestealers, a nicely big scary and fast general purpose melee threats that can take down some infantry units. Beyond all that there's just quite a lot of other objective support, 10 Gargoyles, for very nice deep strike then move or big first turn rush type things they can do with their move shoot move, 3 units of 10 Hormagaunts with their very fast movement and charges and plenty of OC, 1 Lictor with their cheap free lone operative and rapid ingress, 1 Biovore for farming objectives with spore mines, and 1 Pyrovore, often used as just a cheap placeholder type unit for doing screening and things, and can threaten a little bit of damage to lighter infantry. Always nice to see people managing to do well with the Tyranids. It doesn't look like the last points changes were massively impactful in terms of picks being taken in this one though I suppose the Lictor went down a bit. Next up we've got the Genestealer Cults, a very niche and rarely played faction, but since the points updates they seem to have been having a rather good time of it, at least in terms of win rates and things, and a couple of lists have done well at big tournaments, maybe most notably this one by Andrew Lewis, who came first at Out of the Furnace 5. This list seems to be one that's really sticking very heavily to the Genestealer Cult power units, 3 units of 20 neophyte hybrids with the seismic cannons and grenade launchers. They each give a massive damage punch when you combine their deep strike buff with things like the extra AP from Ridge Runners, and your choice of a couple of good stratagems. Maybe the most unusual looking thing though is 4 units of Acolyte hybrids all with max demo charges. That does tend to be a bit more than most people usually run. It's super easy to deliver 2 units of them, each paying a command point to basically drop in anywhere just outside of 3 inches and throw demo charges in people's faces, but you can only usually do that twice unless you're returning units to reserve and things. I guess that due to that maybe one of them is infiltrating with the Nexos with Inscrutable Cunning. That could give you a pretty massive first turn damage boost. And then it looks like the last unit is riding in a Goliath truck, now a bit cheaper at 90 points. They were a bit overcosted before I think. Otherwise to support them all there's 3 Primuses for their 4 rerolls to hit. I'd guess they'd probably go with the Neophytes normally, but I guess you could change it up depending on opponents. They can make their Overwatch rather savage as well, and allow you to put more things in strategic reserve than you otherwise could. Otherwise there's a Clamavus for objective support with Deep Strike Denial. Not actually sure if he's actually joining a unit or might just be trying to hold the home field all on his own. 2 Reductor Saboteurs for cheapish lone operatives that have a whole load of explosive threats if the enemy gets too close and underestimates them. Very nasty with 4 different flavours of grenade to throw around. And then finally 2 Achilles Ridge Runners with mortars, both to hand out extra AP against the targets that most need it. One of them gets a spotter and one of them the cover ignoring survey auger. They could also be handy enough to camp and defend home field objectives. You certainly do get a whole load of really big scary deep strike threats if you pass up on a big aberrant blob or anything like that. The units might not be all that tough once they're on the board, but they potentially can recycle as well with Cult Ambush, and while they are there they have a massive amount of objective control and regenerating models with Cult Icons. All very scary, and Genestealer Cults are usually a spooky list to play against given that the game is more in your opponent's control. All the deep strike things means that you're often having to react to them rather than the other way round. Next up, we've got some Space Elves in the Aeldari, previously the Scourge of 10th edition, but now looking a lot more mid-tier. This list by Daleman took second at a tournament called Capital Clash Get 'em Boys, going 5 wins undefeated in a 32-player tournament. In spite of a few points increases, this one still goes very heavy on the small units of fast movers that Aeldari have often been using. 2 units of the Jump Shoot Jump Shadow Spectres with the fairly big damage, 2 units of Swooping Hawks that can leap on and off the board and do some good anti-infantry firepower, and 3 units of the Flicker Jumping Fast Moving Warp Spiders with their devastating wound torrents. Otherwise, we've got some infiltration shenanigans in a couple of units of Rangers which could screen out the board fairly nicely if you needed them to, and there'd be enough of them to threaten to kill certain support characters given the battle host rerolls they get. 10 Storm Guardians, which actually seem to have been relatively common includes in army lists now, given the sticky objectives, and it certainly helped that they went down in cost a bit, and a couple of small squads of fast-moving Skyweavers, these ones with Haywire Cannons and Zephyrglaives. Interesting enough, fast-moving Aeldari skirmish-type units. It looks like the Reaper Shrine is representing here with 3 units of Dark Reapers, Exarchs with Tempest launchers for some perhaps surprisingly good ignores line of sight shooting. They're still mainly going to be a threat to lighter things, but 3 of those put together can certainly leave a mark. There's an Autarch Wayleaper who farms command points, and he has Fate's Messenger to flip dice to 6s when he needs to. Fugan the Burning Lance without any fire dragons, who's just a massive threat in his own right and can make particularly good use of Fate dice 6s. Particularly in Overwatch, his stands up when he dies ability still allows him to cause problems even if he isn't very tough per point. And finally in a big and interesting unit we've got Ivrain with an 11-man Harlequin troop, 4 fusion pistols, and then the rest all taking Harlequin special weapons. Looks like they're riding to battle in a Wave Serpent. Ivrain generally making the unit really quite threatening against enemy infantry. Her Storm of Whispers is a pretty nasty shooting attack as well. Kind of fun to see them there, even if the list isn't being run as Inari. It seems she wasn't the Warlord in this selection, that was the Autarch Wayleaper, and there's no Drukhari units being used. I'm sure the community is going to have a fairly long memory for the sins of the Aeldari in early 10th edition, but at the moment they're really quite well balanced, and it's cool to see foot dial lists like this being very viable. Though I certainly feel like there's lots of pieces here that are very player skill dependent, and you need to make a lot of clever use of terrain to stop the fragile units dying too quickly. Next up for the Drukhari, they still have sort of mid-table win percentages that maybe aren't breaking through to the top of tournaments all that commonly, but if anyone's going to, it's probably going to be Mr. Rivdan Martinez, aka Skari from Scardcast, who used this to take first at Capital Clash GT, a smallish grand tournament in Canada, going 4 wins and 1 draw at a 27-player event. I'd say perhaps the most unexpected thing for me from the list are a couple of Void Raven bombers. I hadn't seen too many people using those since the early days of 10th edition. And what's more, it's interesting that it's the dark scythes being used rather than the big scary void lancers. You can have 4 shots per plane going at strength 14 and damage d6 plus 2, which is kind of terrifying. But instead going for a big 12 shots at strength 8, AP 4 and damage 2, prioritising more for killing infantry and space marines. With 400 points of plane though, they're certainly a threat that you can't ignore when they turn up turn 2, even if they're not really very tough per point and just 12 wounds at toughness 9. Otherwise though, the rest is a whole load of Sky Splinter goodness, a Raider with a Dark Lance and 4 Venoms. I'm guessing it's the Witch squad with Leave Hesperax that goes in the Raider, threatening a very long charge with the nasty jump out and charge stratagem that they get. They'll be able to blend most lighter targets with a Lance keyword and a Pain token. Otherwise, between the other transports, there's 2 Archons. I guess one would lead Incubi, the other maybe that quarter of the Archon. Again, very nasty threats in their own right. And then 2 units of Kabbalite Warriors, which I guess are going to be split by the Venoms. So you have 4 squads of 5 in total, good for the sticky objectives, and still have some nasty lance firepower. There's a Beastmaster for scouting up the board and causing issues early on, potentially doing move blocks and things, or charging things that don't want to be charged turn 1. 2 units of 5 Mandrakes for some near auto include first turn screening and objective grabbing things plus fading away. A Kronos Parasite engine for farming some pain tokens is just far tougher than its points would normally mean, and 2 units of 5 Scourges, one with Dark Lances and one with Haywire. Interesting to see the use of Haywire there. Again, I've not really seen much besides Dark Lances on those. In any case, pretty cool to see a Drukhari list with a few different twists, and it does look like he's got a full breakdown of the list over on Scarredcast. Might be one to catch for Drukhari players who want it explained far better than I ever could. Next up, we've got Xenos from the Tomb Worlds with the Necrons. This list by someone called Archeon14 used it to take first at the Brittany Open, going undefeated against 82 players. This one does seem to be a fairly cookie cutter Canoptech Court type list, basically taking most of the things that went up in points last update, still having the 3 massive squads of Wraiths with their particle blasters and claws, backed up by the Technomancers, one taking the Tesla Weave and one taking the Dimensional Sanctum to infiltrate and threaten first turn charges and things. One unit of 3 Scarab Swarms, which are handy to have around for secondary objectives and things, as is one single Locust Destroyer. Then for some heavy firepower, there's 3 Canoptech Doomstalkers, all getting rerolls to hit in the Power Matrix in the Canoptech Court, and both they and the Wraiths can threaten to do the can't shoot me from greater than 12 inches stratagem, which is really quite disruptive if you're trying to take down some tough Necron threats. You might shoot them half to death, then they hide, and then they start healing. The Wraiths can also make some great use of the reactive movement stratagem as well, which can be very disruptive on midfield objective takers. Finally, there's 2 Catan, a Transcendent for warping round the board and being quite good against medium infantry, and the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, still bringing the focused damage against tanks and vehicles. Certainly still shows that Necrons are well capable of taking down a big grand tournament with the same list that they had before. Maybe it's a bit of a nod to how undercosted a few of these things were previously, though it definitely looks like it to be a far harder job than the other support that you'd have if you had a few more points. Necrons certainly seem to be a lot more in line with the other strong armies in the game, rather than head and shoulders above. Next up, we've got the Leagues of Votann, this list by Junior Affley taking first, going 6-0 undefeated in really quite a big tournament of 154 players. Quite a big achievement for the Space Dwarves, who at least in fairly recent times didn't seem to have been taking too many crowns of the really big tournaments, mainly just seeing a bit of occasional success in the slightly smaller ones. As Leagues of Votann armies go, this one feels like quite a well balanced one. Pretty much all of their mainline units are represented here. There's a good amount of armour in 3 Sagittars with the missile launchers, scouting out and having some good firepower and transporting some things into battle. Looks like they're taking the Hearthkin Warriors, split into 2 units, plus the Chthonian Berserks for a bit of melee. There's a tanky Hecaton Land Fortress with the SP Conversion Beamer loadout, quite a big threat with Judgment tokens, particularly when he can be getting +1 to hit and wound. I'm not sure if it's planning to transport anything, like maybe the smaller unit of Brockir Thunderkin perhaps, or the Iron Here Hearthguard unit could go there potentially, can give you some nice wound re-rolls when you get out of the transport. Speaking of which, there's 2 units of Brockir Thunderkin, one of 6 and one of 3, all with the Graviton Blast Cannons. They're just quite good general purpose weapons that have anti-vehicle and enough shots and strength and AP to make infantry fear them as well. One of them will be joined by a Brockir Iron Master with Appraising Glare. I guess he'd be more likely to join the big units to give them his shooting buffs and defensive type things, and they could be an okay choice for a sort of reserves threat maybe. The challenge with the blast cannons is getting them in range with their 18-inch shooting. Otherwise, the 3 units of Hernkin Pioneers, all with the high-last rotary things and the scanner and searchlight, they can scout forward and put some good damage on things that get the 2 Judgment token debuffs early in the game, maybe getting the command points early. And then finally there's 2 units of Ironhair Hearthguard, each joined by an Ironhair champion with Mass Hammer, very hard hitting on the charge between their mortal wounds and their anti-tank style damage. One of them has Grim Demeanor to ignore some modifiers, and they're both joining units of the Hearthguard with the Concussion Gauntlets and Vulcanite. I guess the big squad would probably deep strike. It can just do an enormous amount of shooting damage at reserve, particularly if you use that sustained hits 2 stratagem on them. Looks like quite a fun and well balanced Leagues of Votann list. A bit of on the board firepower, lots of scouting things to get lines and angles on things early, and then some big damage punches to arrive later in the game. Next up we have the Orks, who do seem to have been doing at least fairly well with a bunch of different detachments. The most notable one by far though is Bully Boys, easily being seen as the strongest and being played by a lot of people to big success. This list by Michael Mann was used to take second at Rocky Top Rumble, going 6 wins to 0 losses against a 32 player tournament. And this one really doesn't hold back on the war bosses, 3 war bosses with power claw, 3 in mega armor, 1 with the teleporter enhancement. The mega bosses all going with squads with twin kill saws, 2 units of 5 and 1 unit of 6, and the regular bosses all going with regular nob squads, again armed with power claws. One of the mega nobs will go in deep strike with the teleporter, I guess, and then between the rest of them they'll be piling into 3 trucks and a battle wagon with an art case. I think that's enough to transport all of them, plus the big unit of 10 flash kits, which is maybe the biggest surprise for the army. Seemingly a whole bunch of focused anti-infantry style firepower at close range, good enough to see and include, even with the removal of Captain Badrock. I feel like they are a pretty cool threat against infantry at least, and if the enemy cares about mass AP0 attacks in the fight phase, they can definitely hand out a bunch of things there as well. Bully Boys is the one that gives all the nobs and the boss units a second turn of war. Absolutely massive on the mega nobs with their 4+ feel no pain type saves, and really good on everything else with the extra attacks and strength and the invulnerable saves. They have some other good stratagems as well, including 4 rerolls to hit, and the one for debuffing AP by 1. That can make mega nobs get to yet another crazy level of durability. Finally, to round out the list, there's a few objective grabbers. Boss Necrons as the Orky lone operative who can teleport across the board once per game. 2 units of Gretchen that can farm command points and put a lot of OC on home field points and things, and 1 unit of 5 Storm Boys, generally used for jumping around and doing secondaries dead quick. As ever with Bully Boys, the Mega Nobs just give it a ridiculous amount of raw strength. There's a whole load of close combat threats that you just can't really ignore here. Finally for the Xenos, we have the Tau Empire. In the first couple of weeks since their codex points have been out, it doesn't look like they've had enormous amounts of success. Definitely some players getting towards top tables, but no big event wins yet. Games Workshop definitely gave them a bit of a firm redress, with some big nerfs to things like Breaches and Devilfish, and a few other notable points increases in the digital points. One list that did do quite well though, going 6-1 at a massive 139 player tournament, was this list by Stephen Crawley, using it to take 8th at Rocky Top Rumble. This one's Montcar, and Games Workshop flipped that around recently to be lethal hits if you're guided, and then assault just generally for the first 3 turns, plus a few really quite powerful stratagems. There's some nice stuff for Devilfish Breaches in particular. Perhaps the most weird and wonderful thing about this list is using 2 Forge World Tiger Sharks, admittedly genuinely very good firepower units. They each get 2 enormous railgun shots each at strength 20, AP 5 and damage d6 plus 6, plus 2 cyclic ion blasters and 2 sky spear missiles for a bunch of spam strength 6 damage 1. When they hit back, they are at least fairly tough for flies as well. 18 wounds at toughness 11 and a 5+ invulnerable save could be worse. Otherwise, for pushing up and striking the killing blow early with Montcar, there's 3 units of Devilfish Breaches, these ones opting not to take the Cadra Fireblades, still seeming to be scary enough without them though, with the lethal hits, plus the option of combat debarkation if they need to reroll wound rolls and their target doesn't happen to be on objective. There's a Riptide with the Iron Accelerator and Plasma Rifles that could be okay to push up a bit more bravely than some of the rest, a bit of backfield's fire support in the Broadside and Skyray. They could make good enough use of the advance and shoot of Montcar. Some nice infiltrators in some stealth suits, marking targets for the rest and giving you reroll ones to hit and wound. They're massively better observer units than anything else, given that Tetras aren't a thing anymore in competitive. 5 skirmishing Kroot Hounds, the nice lone operative that is Commander Shadowsun with her boss for nearby units. Dark Strider, who's been taken alone, I guess just to deny deep strike here. Could be a throwaway secondary objective doer if the opponent's not doing reserve things, I guess. And then an Ethereal that has the strike swiftly enhancement. That one allows you to scout move 2 units 6 inches to get them into the midfield early. If I had to guess, I'd guess that'd probably go on the Devilfish. After that, I suppose the Ethereal's probably just hiding out of line of sight on its own. They can still make themselves useful, farming some command points turn on turn. Overall, definitely a lot going on with that one. Plenty of objective skirmishing and some very scary breaches in Devilfish, and then all waiting for the enormous damage punch that are the Tiger Sharks coming in, or very scary railgun Alpha Strike power indeed. In any case, I think we'll leave that there with the Xenos armies talked about. Hope you've enjoyed a roundup of one strong army list for every Warhammer 40k faction. Certainly a lot to talk about with all the crazy stuff going on. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.